Tonight, we're going to talk about an empire that should not have existed. On a spring morning in the year 330, in a small Greek town perched on a narrow strip of water between two continents, a Roman emperor stood in the dust of a construction site and traced with the point of his spear the line where the new walls of his city would rise. His courtiers, watching him walk on and on, eventually grew nervous at how much ground he was enclosing, and one of them at last dared to ask how far he intended to go. The emperor is said to have answered, without turning his head, that he would walk until the one who went before him stopped. It was a strange thing to say, and it hinted at something stranger still, that this man believed a hand not his own was guiding the shape of what he was making. The city he founded that day would outlive the Rome he had inherited by nearly 1,000 years. It would be besieged more than 20 times, sacked by fellow Christians, burned by rioters, ravaged by plague, and yet again and again it would rise, patch its walls, crown a new emperor, and go on. This is the story of that city and of the empire that refused to die. Before we go further, if you find something restful in these long, quiet histories, you might like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. There is no need otherwise. And if you feel like it, leave your city and the hour of your night in the comments below. It is a gentle thing to know that someone in another town, in another quiet room, is settling into the same story you are. So make yourself comfortable, dim your lamps, rest your head on the pillow, and let yourself begin to drift. The tale we are about to walk through is a long one, and it can be told slowly. There is nowhere to hurry. To understand how a new Rome came to be planted on the Bosphorus, we must first understand how badly the old Rome had come apart. By the middle of the 3rd century, the empire that had once seemed eternal was staggering. Emperors were being murdered by their own soldiers with such regularity that a man might wear the purple for a few months or a few weeks before some general with a stronger army dragged him from his throne and put on the diadem himself. Between the year 235 and the year 284, there were more than 50 men who claimed the imperial title, and most of them died violently. On the frontiers, the news was no better. From beyond the Rhine and the Danube, Germanic peoples pressed against the crumbling border forts. In the east, a new and formidable Persian empire, the Sassanids, humiliated Rome again and again, and on one dreadful day captured a Roman emperor alive and kept him as a living footstool for their king. The old civic life of the western cities was contracting. Coins were losing their silver. Trade was faltering. And in the countryside, great walled estates began to take the place of the little farms of free citizens. Into this exhausted world came a soldier from the province of Dalmatia named Diocletian, who seized the throne in the year 284 and did something no emperor had done in generations. He set the ship of state upright. He was a hard, practical man of humble birth, with no illusions about the glories of the past and a clear-eyed view of what the empire actually needed. He decided the realm had grown too vast for one ruler, and so he divided it. He took the wealthier and more populous eastern half for himself, ruled from a city in what is now Turkey, and gave the poorer, more troubled western half to a colleague. Each of them appointed a junior emperor, so that in time there were 4 rulers, working together in what history calls the Tetrarchy. He reformed the coinage, reorganized the army, redrew the map of the provinces into smaller and more manageable units, and gathered around the imperial person a new solemnity, robes of silk and diadems set with pearls, a court of ranks and titles borrowed in part from the Persian enemies he had spent his life fighting. When he finally stepped down of his own free will, an almost unheard-of thing for a Roman emperor, and retired to grow cabbages by the Adriatic, he could look back on a career that had, against all expectation, held the empire together. But the Tetrarchy did not survive its own founder. As soon as Diocletian was gone, the 4 rulers began quarreling, and their sons and generals were drawn into the quarrels behind them. Out of the confusion that followed rose one of the most consequential figures in the whole story of the ancient world, a man named Constantine. He was the son of one of the junior emperors, a rough soldier from the western provinces, and he had been raised at Diocletian's court almost as a kind of hostage to ensure his father's loyalty. When his father died in the year 306, At the great fortress town of York in Britain, the soldiers there raised Constantine on their shields and hailed him as their emperor. For the next 18 years, he fought his way slowly through the tangle of rival rulers, defeating them one by one, until at last he stood alone as the sole master of the Roman world. Along the way, in the year 312, on the eve of a battle for the city of Rome itself, something happened that Constantine would tell people about for the rest of his life. According to the story he later authorized, he looked up into the afternoon sky and saw a sign, a cross of light traced above the sun, and heard or read within it the promise that under this sign he would conquer. He ordered his soldiers to paint the symbol on their shields, marched down on his rival at the Milvian Bridge just outside Rome, and won a decisive victory. The pagan emperor who opposed him drowned in the Tiber trying to flee. Constantine, at that moment, could plausibly have credited the God of the Christians with his triumph, and in a way that would astonish everyone, he did. Christianity, at the time of the Milvian Bridge, was still a minority faith in the empire, and one that had suffered terrible persecutions under Diocletian only a few years earlier. Its followers had been hunted, their scriptures burned, their bishops martyred. Now, the man who wore the purple began, cautiously at first, and then more boldly, to favor them. He returned confiscated property to their churches. He gave bishops the right to hear certain civil cases. He himself began to speak of the Christian God as his particular patron, though he would not be formally baptized until he lay on his deathbed. And when he called the bishops of the empire to a great council at Nicaea in the year 325, to hammer out their disagreements about the nature of Christ, he sat at the head of the assembly himself, a Roman emperor presiding over the internal quarrels of a faith that only a decade or two earlier had been an underground movement. Something enormous was shifting, and one could feel it even at the time. But he did more than change the religion of the empire. He also decided, and this is the deed for which the East will remember him longest, that Rome itself, the old city on the Tiber, was no longer the right place from which to rule the Roman world. It was too far from the frontiers that mattered. Its senate was full of pagan aristocrats who resented him. Its geography was inconvenient for defense. The center of gravity of the empire had been drifting east for a century already, toward the wealthy provinces of Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt, where the great cities were, where the trade routes converged, where the tax revenues piled up. Constantine, with the instincts of a soldier, saw the map plainly. He wanted a new capital, one that he could shape from the ground up, unencumbered by old jealousies, and set precisely where the empire's real business was done. He chose an ancient Greek town called Byzantium, founded, according to legend, 1,000 years earlier by a colonist named Byzas. The site was almost miraculous in its natural strength. It stood on a triangular peninsula jutting out into the water, with the Sea of Marmara on one side and a deep, narrow inlet called the Golden Horn on the other, forming a superb natural harbor. Only the landward side lay open to attack, and that side could be walled. It sat astride the narrow strait of the Bosphorus, one of the great crossing points of the world, where Europe reaches out toward Asia, and where a ruler holding the waterway could control the trade between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, between the grain of the north and the spices of the east. Ships had to pass beneath his windows. Armies had to march within reach of his walls. It was, in a way that no other place quite was, the meeting point of continents. In the year 324, having just finished defeating his last remaining rival not far from that very spot, Constantine gave the order. The town would be rebuilt on a colossal scale. New walls were laid out. New forums were planned. Columns were shipped in from every corner of the empire, and statues of gods and heroes were stripped from 100 cities to adorn the streets of the new capital. Craftsmen and stonecutters were drafted from across the provinces. The old pagan temples of Byzantium were left standing at first, but new Christian churches began to rise beside them. Constantine gave the city his own name, calling it Constantinople, the city of Constantine, though its people would go on calling it, quite simply, the city, as though there could be no other. On a May morning in the year 330, only 6 years after work had begun, he presided over the formal dedication. There were processions, and games, and the burning of incense, and the setting up of a great porphyry column at the heart of the city, on top of which stood a statue that combined the features of the sun god with those of Constantine himself. It was neither wholly pagan nor wholly Christian. It was something new and something old and something that had not existed before that moment. The city Constantine had founded did not spring into greatness all at once. In its first decades, it was a construction site more than a capital, dust and scaffolding everywhere. Half its grand avenue still marked out only by stakes in the ground. But Constantine had planted it well, and it grew with astonishing speed. Free bread was distributed to those who came to live within its walls, in imitation of the ancient dole that had drawn crowds to old Rome. Merchants arrived to sell their goods at its markets. Craftsmen came for the work. Bishops came because the emperor was there, and where the emperor was, the great decisions of the church were made. Within a generation, the population had swollen into the hundreds of thousands, and the ships of every trading nation crowded the wharves of the Golden Horn. Constantine himself did not live long to enjoy what he had built. Died in the year 337, only 7 years after the city's dedication, and he was buried in a great church he had prepared for himself, the Church of the Holy Apostles, where his tomb stood in the midst of 12 empty sarcophagi representing the disciples of Christ, so that he might rest, as it were, as their equal. The empire he left behind he divided among his 3 surviving sons, who promptly began to murder one another in the way that Roman princes had long done. But the city he had made would go on. It had already begun to develop the shape it would keep for 1,000 years, a shape that reveals itself best if you imagine walking through it in those early centuries. At the tip of the peninsula stood the imperial palace, an enormous complex of halls, gardens, chapels, and terraces that ran down toward the sea. Beside it stood the hippodrome, the great racecourse borrowed in form from the Circus Maximus of Rome, an oval arena that could hold tens of thousands of spectators, with its long central spine adorned by ancient monuments hauled in from across the empire, including an obelisk that had once stood in Egypt in the days of the pharaohs and still stands there in Istanbul today. Beside the palace and the hippodrome rose a great church built by Constantine's son and dedicated to holy wisdom, in Greek Hagia Sophia. It was not yet the towering domed marvel that later generations would raise on the same spot. That was still 2 centuries away. But even in its first form, it was one of the largest churches in the world, and the seat of the Patriarch of Constantinople, the chief bishop of the Eastern Church. From that heart, the great processional avenue called the Mise ran westward, straight as an arrow, lined with colonnades and shops and forums where statues of emperors gazed down at the crowds. There was the Forum of Constantine with its porphyry column, and further along the Forum of Theodosius, and further still the Forum of the Ox, each larger than the last, each a marketplace and a public square, and a stage for imperial ceremony all at once. The avenue passed at last through the great walls at the western edge of the city, and on out into the countryside, toward Thrace and the Balkan provinces beyond. The people who lived within those walls came from every corner of the empire and beyond. There were Greeks, of course, since this had always been Greek country, and their language was already the tongue of the streets and the schools, even though the government still conducted its business in Latin. There were Syrians and Egyptians, Armenians and Cappadocians, Goths who had taken service in the imperial armies, Slavs and Bulgars and Persians who had come as traders or as prisoners or as refugees. Jewish communities kept their own quarter. Sailors from Italy and Africa mingled on the docks. Christian pilgrims passed through on their way to the holy places of the East. It was already, in these early centuries, the most cosmopolitan city in the Christian world. While Constantinople was rising, the older half of the empire, the Latin West, was beginning to fail. Through the 4th century and into the 5th, the pressure on the western frontiers grew unbearable. Whole peoples were on the move, pushed out of the steppes of Central Asia by the terrifying advance of the Huns, and they poured across the Rhine and the Danube in numbers no Roman army could turn back. In the year 378, at a place called Adrianople, only a few days' march from Constantinople, a Roman emperor met the Goths in battle and was killed along with most of his army. And after that day the Goths were never truly expelled from Roman soil again. They were settled, bought off, hired as soldiers, given lands, married into the aristocracy, and slowly, without anyone quite deciding it, they became part of the fabric of the empire itself. In the year 410, a Gothic king named Alaric led his army into the city of Rome itself and sacked it, an event that sent a shudder through the entire ancient world. Rome, the eternal city, the mother of nations, plundered by barbarians. The news reached as far as the deserts of Palestine, where an old scholar named Jerome, translating the Bible into Latin in his cave, wrote that the light of the whole world had been extinguished, that the city which had taken the world captive was itself taken. And yet Constantinople, only a few weeks' journey away, was scarcely touched. Its walls were strong. Its treasury was full. Its diplomats were skilled. When the barbarians pressed against the eastern frontier, the eastern emperors bought them off, or turned them westward, or hired them as federates, and the great migrations of peoples flowed on past the new capital and broke instead upon the older provinces of the west. Through the 5th century, the western half continued to bleed. Vandals crossed into Spain and then into North Africa, seizing the province that had for centuries supplied Rome with its grain. Franks moved into Gaul. Angles and Saxons took Britain. Goths carved out kingdoms in Italy and southern France. Emperors came and went in the western capital, which was no longer Rome, but the marshy fortress town of Ravenna, and most of them were puppets in the hands of Germanic generals. Finally, in the year 476, one such general named Odoacer decided that the pretense had gone on long enough. He deposed the last Western emperor, a boy who by cruel coincidence bore the name Romulus, the name of Rome's legendary founder, and sent the imperial regalia east to Constantinople with a polite message. There was no need, he wrote, for a separate emperor in the west. The one in the east would suffice. And so, in the eyes of the men who lived through it, the Western Empire did not so much fall as quietly dissolve. There was no thunderclap, no single day of catastrophe. The Roman Senate went on meeting in Rome for another century. The Latin language went on being spoken. The roads went on being used. But the political fact was plain. In the West, there were now kingdoms of Franks and Goths and Vandals, ruled by Germanic warriors who paid a distant and formal respect to the emperor in Constantinople while running their own affairs. And in the East, there was still an empire, Roman in its laws, Christian in its faith, increasingly Greek in its speech, and centered upon a city that had never been sacked. The people of that Eastern Empire never called themselves Byzantines. That name was invented centuries later by scholars in the West, borrowed from the ancient Greek town of Byzantium, and imposed on them by historians who wished to draw a line between their own Roman heritage and this stranger, Greek-speaking Christian civilization to the east. But the people themselves knew what they were. They were Romaeoi Romans, and their emperor was the Roman emperor, and their city was Rome, the new Rome, and their empire had never fallen, because how could it fall when its capital still stood, and its emperor still reigned, and its bishops still met, and its coinage still bore the old imperial titles? To them, the disturbance in the West was a great misfortune, a loss of provinces, a shame to be someday put right, but it was not the end of the Roman world. The Roman world had simply contracted around its stronger half and gone on breathing. Through the late 5th century and into the 6th, that stronger half consolidated itself. The city on the Bosphorus grew richer still. A new set of walls was thrown around it during the reign of an emperor named Theodosius II, walls of triple defense, deep ditches and outer and inner ramparts, studded with towers, running from the Sea of Marmara up across the peninsula to the Golden Horn. These walls, when they were finished, were the strongest fortifications any city in the world possessed, and they would stand for 1,000 years, turning back every enemy who came against them, until at last a single new invention would finally shatter what no army had ever broken. But that lay far in the future. For now, the walls simply stood, and behind them the city prospered. Emperors came and went, some able and some feeble, but the machinery of the state ground on. There were quarrels over doctrine that convulsed the church, disputes about the exact nature of Christ, about the two natures, divine and human, about how they were joined, that seem obscure to us now, but that could bring riots into the streets of Constantinople and split whole provinces from imperial obedience. There were troubles with the Persians in the east, who remained the empire's oldest and most respected rival, a civilized power to be treated with, warred with, and treated with again. There were troubles with the tribes on the northern frontiers, the various Slavic and Turkic peoples pressing down from the steppe. But the empire endured, and the wealth of the eastern provinces kept flowing into the treasuries, and the fleets of Constantinople kept patrolling the waters, and the diplomats of Constantinople kept spinning the elaborate webs of alliance and marriage and bribery by which the new Rome maintained its position among the peoples of the world. Then, in the last years of the 5th century, an elderly and childless soldier of no particular distinction named Justin was serving in the imperial guard. He had come to the city as a young man out of the peasant villages of the Balkans, an illiterate herdsman with nothing but his sword and his strength, and he had risen slowly through the ranks by luck and hard fighting. When the reigning emperor died in the year 518 without a clear successor, the guards and the Senate, in one of those strange convulsions by which Byzantium sometimes chose its masters, settled on old Justin as the compromise candidate. He was crowned, he ruled adequately for 9 years, and he prepared the way, without knowing quite how important it was, for the man who would come after him. That man was his nephew, whom Justin had brought to the capital as a boy and educated with care, and who had grown into a formidable statesman. His name was Justinian, and with him, and with the extraordinary woman who would sit beside him on the throne, the new Rome was about to attempt something audacious. It was about to try to become the old Rome again. Justinian was already the real power behind his uncle's throne long before he formally wore the crown himself. He was in his 40s when old Justin finally died in the year 527, a man of medium height and unremarkable appearance, with a broad, calm face and a manner so restrained that ambassadors sometimes mistook him for a lesser official until they were introduced. He slept little, ate simply, and worked late into the night by lamplight, reading dispatches and drafting laws in his own hand. He was patient, secretive, and endlessly persistent, and he came to the throne with a program in mind that was nothing less than the restoration of the Roman Empire itself. The old western provinces would be recovered, the Roman law would be gathered and clarified, the Christian faith would be defined and enforced, the city of Constantinople would be beautified beyond anything the world had seen. It was an enormous vision for one man to hold in his head, and he held it for nearly 40 years, and by main force of will he made most of it come to pass. Beside him at the head of the empire stood his wife Theodora, and here we must pause, because there has rarely been a stranger road to the imperial throne than hers. She was the daughter of a bear keeper at the hippodrome, a man whose humble job was to look after the animals used in the games. When her father died young, her mother was left destitute with 3 little girls, and she brought them out onto the sand of the arena during a break in the races, dressed in wreaths and rags, and held them up to beg the mercy of the crowd. That is the first glimpse we have of the future empress, a small girl on the floor of the hippodrome, pleading for her family's bread. She was raised in the theatre, which in that age was scarcely distinguishable from the world of the courtesans, and she made her living for a time by her wits, her body, and a talent for comic performance that scandalized the respectable gossips of the city. She traveled to Egypt and North Africa, had a child by some man whose name we do not know, drifted back to the capital, and at some point in her 20s, quite mysteriously, put that life behind her. She was working as a wool spinner in a modest house near the palace when Justinian, then still the emperor's nephew, first noticed her. He fell in love with her instantly and completely, and he never wavered from her again. The law forbade a senator to marry an actress, so he had the law changed. When his aunt the empress, who had disliked Theodora from the start, at last died, he married her without further delay, and when he ascended the throne, she was crowned beside him and named Augusta, the equal partner of his rule. The old Roman aristocracy was appalled. A former dancing girl from the hippodrome now sat on the throne of the Caesars, wore the purple, gave audience to foreign ambassadors, corresponded with bishops, and expected the same reverence as the emperor himself. But there was no arguing with the fact. Justinian trusted her judgment absolutely. She had a mind like a knife, and she was to prove it soon enough, in a week that came very close to destroying them both. The trouble began, as trouble in Constantinople often did, at the Hippodrome. The great arena was more than a place of entertainment. It was the beating heart of the city's public life, the one place where the emperor met his people face to face, and where the crowd, in its tens of thousands, could shout back at him as it never could anywhere else. The people were organized into two enormous factions named for the colors of the charioteers they supported, the blues and the greens. These were not sports clubs in any modern sense. They were something closer to political parties, street gangs, and religious brotherhoods rolled together. They had their own leaders, their own toughs, their own quarters of the city, and their own opinions on every doctrinal quarrel and every imperial appointment. An emperor's popularity could be measured by the roar that greeted him when he entered his private box above the arena, and an unpopular ruler might find himself facing a wall of catcalls that shook the very stones. Justinian, in the 5th year of his reign, had made himself unpopular. His government had been squeezing the wealthy for taxes to pay for his ambitious plans, and squeezing the poor as well, and two of his ministers in particular had become hated figures. There was John of Cappadocia, a brutally efficient tax collector who wrung the last coin out of every province, and Tribonian, the legal expert who had begun the reform of the laws. Their methods were so heavy-handed that both factions of the Hippodrome, who normally hated each other with all their hearts, began, dangerously, to make common cause against them. In January of the year 532, a routine execution of criminals in the city went wrong. Two condemned men, one a blue and one a green, fell from the gallows still living when the ropes broke, and the monks who took them into sanctuary refused to give them up to the authorities. When the emperor appeared at the Hippodrome for the games a few days later, both factions united in a single cry, demanding mercy for the two men. He ignored them. They shouted louder. And then, in a way no one had heard before, they began to shout together a new word, a word that meant simply victory or conquest in Greek. Nika, they cried. Nika, Nika. By nightfall, the mob was in the streets. They freed the two condemned men from their monastery and swept through the city, setting fires as they went. The Praetorium, the police headquarters, was burned. The great church of Hagia Sophia, still the older and smaller building that Constantine's son had raised, was set alight and reduced to a shell. The Senate house burned. A whole quarter of Constantinople, from the palace to the Forum of Constantine, was consumed in flames. When the emperor tried to appease the crowd by dismissing his hated ministers, they smelled weakness and grew bolder. They dragged a nephew of a former emperor from his house and proclaimed him the new ruler, crowning him with a gold chain snatched from a statue, and set about besieging Justinian in his own palace. For nearly a week, the rioting went on. The city was out of control, the imperial guard was uncertain of whom to obey, and Justinian, watching the smoke rise over Constantinople, at last called his ministers together in an inner chamber of the palace and told them frankly that he thought all was lost. Ships were being made ready at the private harbor beside the palace. The treasure was being loaded. He would flee, he said, to some loyal province and try to raise an army and come back. The ministers agreed. It was the sensible course. And then Theodora spoke. We do not know her exact words, though a courtier who was present tried to record them for us afterward, and the version that survives has echoed through the centuries. She stood, we are told, and said that even if flight would save their lives, she did not think it worth saving them so. She reminded them that whoever was born must die, but that for one who had ruled it was intolerable to become a fugitive. She would not, she said, put off the purple robe she wore, and she would not live to see the day when men who met her did not call her mistress. If Justinian wished to save himself, he had money and ships and the sea. She quoted, according to the tradition, an old saying that had come down from antiquity, that the purple made a fine burial shroud. And she sat down. Justinian looked at her, and the ships at the private harbor were forgotten. He turned to two of his generals, both of them proven soldiers, a man named Belisarius, who was already the finest commander of the age, though still young, and an older general named Mundus, and he gave them their orders. That afternoon, the mob was gathered in the Hippodrome to acclaim their new emperor. Justinian's agents had already been at work, quietly bribing the leaders of the blue faction with heavy purses, reminding them that Justinian had always favored their color, and persuading them to slip away from the crowd. Then, with the Greens and the remaining rioters packed into the arena, Belisarius and Mundus led their soldiers, hardened veterans of the Persian wars, in through the two main gates at either end. They shut the doors behind them, and they went to work. What followed was not a battle, it was a slaughter. 30,000 people, some sources say more, were cut down in the sand of the Hippodrome that afternoon. The pretender who had been crowned that morning was seized and executed. The city, which had risen against Justinian, awoke the next day to find itself in his hands as it had never been before. The factions were cowed. The Senate was silent. The streets were emptied of any who dared oppose him. It was a horrifying victory, and it settled the emperor's throne beneath him for the rest of his long reign. Whether Theodora slept easily that night, no one can say. But she had saved his crown, and she knew it, and so did he. Justinian now stood, blood-stained but supreme, over a city that lay half in ashes. And here the second remarkable thing about his character revealed itself. Where another ruler might have rebuilt what had burned, he decided to build something entirely new. The old Hagia Sophia, the great church that Constantine's son had put up 2 centuries before, was now a blackened ruin. Justinian looked at that ruin and resolved to raise upon its site a church that would surpass anything ever built in the Christian world, indeed anything ever built by human hands. He summoned 2 men to plan it, not the usual architects of the day, but a pair of theoretical mathematicians named Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, geometers who had studied the works of Archimedes and Euclid, and he asked them to solve a problem the ancient world had never quite dared to attempt. He wanted a church whose central space would be covered not by wooden beams or barrel vaults, but by an enormous shallow dome, seemingly floating on air, over a square rather than a round chamber. He wanted, in effect, the sky itself brought indoors. The work began within weeks of the riots being put down. 10,000 laborers were set to it. Marbles were quarried from every corner of the empire, green from Thessaly, white from Marmara, purple porphyry from Egypt, yellow stone from Africa, red from the mountains of Phrygia. Columns were pulled from ancient pagan temples and shipped in from Ephesus and Baalbek. Silver was gathered by the ton for the great screen and the altar. Enormous pillars of stone were dragged up onto a hill above the palace. And there, with a speed almost beyond belief, the impossible church began to rise. For 5 years the work went on, day and night, in shifts of laborers whose shouts rose from the hillside so constantly that the neighbors of the palace complained of never being able to sleep. The 2 mathematician architects were feeling their way, for what they were attempting had never been done. The dome, when it was raised, would span more than 100 feet, and it would rest not on a solid ring of masonry, as any sensible dome must, but on 4 great arches springing from 4 massive piers, with curving triangular sections of masonry called pendentives filling the corners and gathering the weight down through the arches to the ground. Beneath the dome, the whole vast space would open unobstructed, so that a worshipper standing in the center could look up and see a golden vault seemingly suspended by nothing at all, pierced at its base by 40 windows, so that the light of morning came flooding in and made the dome appear to hover on a ring of fire. It had never been done because it was very nearly impossible. The horizontal thrust of such a dome, pushing outward at its base, wanted with great insistence to shove the whole church apart, and it was only by careful buttressing, by half-domes on the east and west, by side aisles carrying the outward push down into thick outer walls, that the thing could stand up at all. The architects lived in mortal fear that it would not. The dedication came at the end of the year 537, 5 years and 10 months after the first stone had been laid. Justinian himself rode to the church in procession, and when he had entered and stood at last beneath the great dome, gazing up into that impossible sky of gold, he is said to have raised his hands and cried out, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee." It was not modesty. It was accurate. Nothing like the Hagia Sophia had ever been built. Nothing quite like it would be built for 1,000 years. Even today, standing under that dome, one understands what he meant. The interior seems too large for the walls that hold it. The light seems too soft for the sun outside. The dome seems too broad for the piers that carry it. The whole church is an argument, patiently and permanently made in stone and marble and gold, that the impossible is only what has not yet been attempted with sufficient will. 20 years after the dedication, in fact, an earthquake cracked the Great Dome and part of it collapsed, and a nephew of one of the original architects had to rebuild it a little steeper, a little sturdier. But the church itself stood and stands still. While the Hagia Sophia was rising, Justinian was pushing forward his other great projects, and the most ambitious of them all was the recovery of the western provinces. The Vandals held North Africa. The Ostrogoths held Italy, including Rome itself. The Visigoths held Spain. Southern Gaul had passed to the Franks. To Justinian, brought up on the memory of a single undivided empire, this was intolerable, and he now had, at last, the resources and the man to do something about it. The man was Belisarius, the young general whose soldiers had cleared the Hippodrome in the Nika massacre, and who was proving to be one of the very finest commanders the Roman world had ever produced. In the year 533, Justinian sent Belisarius across the sea with a modest army of 15,000 men and a fleet of 500 ships to attempt what everyone in the eastern capital expected to be a disaster. The Vandals had held North Africa for a century, and their fleet had once burned Rome. But Belisarius landed unopposed on a beach in what is now Tunisia, marched inland with iron discipline, and in 2 swift battles broke the Vandal army utterly. Their king surrendered and was brought in chains to Constantinople, where Justinian granted him lands and a pension, and the wealthy grain-producing provinces of North Africa, lost for a century, returned to Roman rule. It had all been done in a single campaigning season. It seemed almost too easy. Encouraged by this astonishing success, Justinian turned to Italy. Here things would not be so easy. The Ostrogothic kingdom that ruled Italy had been founded by a remarkable warrior king named Theodoric, who had governed the peninsula for over 30 years with a light hand, preserving the Roman Senate, respecting the Roman law, employing Roman civil servants, and building beautifully in the old imperial style. Under his rule, Italy had actually enjoyed something of a recovery. But Theodoric was long dead by Justinian's time, and his heirs were quarrelsome and weak, and the emperor saw his opportunity. In 535, Belisarius crossed to Sicily with a small army, took the island easily, and then in the following spring landed in southern Italy and began to work his way north. He captured Naples after a siege in which some of his soldiers famously crept in through a disused aqueduct. He entered Rome itself in December of 536, welcomed by the Pope, and settled in to defend it against the Gothic counterattack that everyone knew was coming. That counterattack, when it came, was terrible. The Gothic king Witiges brought a huge army south and besieged Rome for over a year. Belisarius, with only a few thousand men behind the ancient Aurelian walls, held out with a mixture of stubbornness, ingenuity, and constant sallies against the besiegers that eventually wore the Goths down. The aqueducts of Rome were cut during that siege and never fully restored. The population of the ancient city, already much diminished, dwindled further under the pressure of hunger. But Belisarius held, and this was where the trouble began. What ought to have been a swift reconquest, on the model of North Africa, turned instead into a war that ground on for 20 years and reduced Italy from a functioning if diminished country into a wasteland. The Goths were tougher than the Vandals had been. They had a base in the north, in Ravenna and the Alpine passes, and they could fall back and regroup. Justinian, distrustful of his overwhelmingly popular general, kept Belisarius short of men and money and eventually recalled him. Other commanders were sent, some able and some incompetent, and the war dragged on. Cities changed hands 4 or 5 times. Rome itself was besieged and taken more than once, and at one dreadful point during the fighting was left almost empty of inhabitants, its senators fled, its churches shut, its streets patrolled by wolves. When at last the fighting ended in the year 554, Italy was formally back within the empire, but it was a ruined shell. The old senatorial aristocracy that had survived the fall of the Western Empire in the 5th century did not survive Justinian's reconquest in the 6th. The Roman Senate ceased to meet. The old civic life of the peninsula ended. And within 15 years, a new Germanic people, the Lombards, would sweep down over the Alps into the exhausted country and take most of it back, so that all Justinian's efforts in Italy would eventually yield only a scattered handful of provinces along the coasts and around Rome itself. There was worse to come. In the year 541, in the middle of the Italian War, a ship from Egypt put in at the Egyptian port of Pelusium carrying, among its cargo, the fleas that ride on rats. The plague that had lain hidden in the interior of Central Africa for uncounted generations had found its way at last to the trade routes of the Mediterranean. From Pelusium, it moved to Alexandria and up the Nile, and from Alexandria, it moved by ship across the sea. And in the spring of 542, it reached Constantinople. What followed was one of the great catastrophes in human history, and one that we now understand was caused by the same bacterium, Yersinia pestis, that would return 8 centuries later as the Black Death. The plague swept through the city with terrible speed. At its height, contemporary writers claim, 5,000 people were dying in Constantinople every day, and later 10,000, and eventually so many that the corpses could not be buried in the ordinary way. Great pits were dug in the fields beyond the walls, and bodies were piled into them by the cartload. The towers of the sea walls were opened and filled with the dead until they overflowed and had to be sealed shut. The streets were choked with the smell. Trade stopped. The government stopped. Justinian himself fell ill, and for a time it was thought that he would die, and Theodora ruled the empire alone in those days, holding the machinery of state together while her husband lay in a fever. He recovered, but when at last the plague passed, perhaps a third of the population of Constantinople was gone, and no one could count how many across the empire had died. The historian Procopius, who lived through it, thought perhaps half of all humanity in the eastern lands had perished, and while modern scholars are more cautious, the loss was certainly enormous. The Justinianic plague, as it came to be called, did not vanish after that first outbreak. It returned again and again, in wave after wave, every 10 or 15 years for the next 2 centuries, striking down each new generation just as it reached maturity. It changed the shape of the empire more thoroughly than any war. The tax revenues collapsed because there were not enough peasants left to farm the land. The armies could not be recruited to full strength. Whole provinces were depopulated, and the villages of Anatolia and Syria emptied out. The great cities of the ancient world, which had held their populations for 1,000 years, now dwindled. The Constantinople that Justinian had rebuilt so magnificently found its markets emptier, its workshops quieter, its neighborhoods spotted with abandoned houses that no one had the money to repair. The plague hollowed the empire out from beneath the very throne on which the emperor sat. Theodora herself did not live to see the worst of the aftermath. She died in the year 548, probably of cancer, at somewhere around 50 years of age. Justinian, who had loved her with a steady and undramatic devotion for nearly 40 years, was said to have wept at her funeral in a way that no one had ever seen him do before. He never remarried, though he had every reason to, and he lived on for another 17 years, growing thinner and older and more solitary, revising his laws, arguing with his theologians, receiving the news of one setback after another with the same quiet patience he had always shown. He died in the year 565 at the age of 83, and by then the great vision he had brought to the throne had begun visibly to fray. Italy was ruined. Africa was troubled. The treasury was empty. The plague still stalked the provinces, but the Hagia Sophia stood. The laws were codified, and the empire, though wounded, would endure. The empire that Justinian left to his successors was in many ways too big for them and too broken. He had stretched every muscle of the Roman state to reconquer Italy and Africa, and though those provinces were once more marked on the maps in imperial colors, they had bled the treasury white in the process. His nephew Justin II inherited the throne in 565, and within a few years he found himself unable to pay the yearly gold that had kept the peace with Persia in the east and had held off the barbarians in the north. The Persians invaded. The Lombards, that new Germanic people, poured over the Alps into Italy in 568 and swiftly took most of what Justinian's armies had spent 20 years to win, so that within a generation the empire held only a scattered handful of Italian territories. Rome itself, Ravenna, the heel and toe of the peninsula, Sicily, and a few coastal strips in between. In the Balkans, Slavic peoples from beyond the Danube began to filter southward in ever greater numbers, settling on lands whose Roman inhabitants had died in the plague or fled to the safety of the walled cities, until whole regions of what had been Greek-speaking Christian country were transformed by Slavic villages and Slavic tongues. Poor Justin II could not bear the strain. He went mad and had to be strapped into his throne by his attendants during audiences, weeping and biting anyone who came near. His Empress Sophia, who was Theodora's niece, ruled in his place with such skill as she could muster, and eventually arranged for a capable general named Tiberius to be adopted as heir. Tiberius proved a decent ruler for the few years he lived, and after him came another soldier named Maurice, a stern and able man who tried, through 20 long years of ceaseless warfare, to stitch the frayed frontiers back together. He fought the Persians to an advantage and even installed a friendly king on their throne. He drove the Slavs and their overlords the Avars back beyond the Danube in a series of hard campaigns. He balanced the books by cutting the pay of his soldiers, which was sensible arithmetic and disastrous politics. In the year 602, mutinous troops on the Danube frontier proclaimed one of their own centurions, a brutal man named Phocas, as emperor and marched on Constantinople. Maurice and his 5 sons were dragged from a monastery where they had taken refuge and murdered one by one, the boys first, in front of their father, and Phocas seized the throne. For 8 years, the empire endured the tyranny of Phocas, and it very nearly did not survive them. He was cruel, drunken, and paranoid, and he executed anyone he suspected of disloyalty, which after a while came to include most of the competent men in his service. The Persian king, who had been Maurice's friend, used the murder as a pretext to invade the eastern provinces, and this time there was no army capable of stopping him. Persian columns swept across Anatolia, took Antioch, took Damascus, and by the year 614 had captured Jerusalem itself. The most sacred relic of Christendom, the true cross that Constantine's mother Helena had discovered 3 centuries before, was carried off in triumph to the Persian capital of Ctesiphon. Christian churches across Syria and Palestine were burned. Jerusalem, when it fell, was said to have lost 60,000 of its inhabitants in the massacres, and its remaining population was led away in chains. For the first time in 3 centuries, a great pagan empire was pressing not merely against the frontiers of the Christian Roman world, but into its very heartland. Rescue came from an unexpected quarter. In the province of Africa, still loyal to the memory of Maurice, the imperial governor was an old and cautious general also named Heraclius. He would not himself come east, but he sent his son, a young man of the same name, sailing from Carthage with a small fleet in the autumn of 610. The younger Heraclius reached the walls of Constantinople in October. The city rose against Phocas, and the tyrant was dragged before the young challenger, insulted, mutilated, and burned. Heraclius the son was crowned emperor at once, and he found himself the ruler of a state so broken that many advised him simply to abandon Constantinople and move the capital to Carthage in Africa, where the empire could regroup. He rejected the advice. He would defend the new Rome or die in it. For 12 dark years, he could do little but hold on. The Persians took Egypt, that ancient granary of the empire, in 619, cutting off the free bread of Constantinople and reducing its population to a fraction of what Justinian had known. Persian armies reached the shore of the Bosphorus itself and looked across at the walls of the capital. The Avars pressed from the west with their Slavic allies. The treasury was empty, the coinage debased, the armies gone. Heraclius, a devout man in the old Roman mold, at last did what no emperor had done in living memory. He took the silver plate of the churches, melted it into coin, borrowed the treasures of the Hagia Sophia itself from the patriarch, raised what troops he could, and in the spring of the year 622, he sailed with his little army to the eastern coast of Anatolia and marched inland, deliberately drawing the war away from Constantinople and into the mountains and plateaus of Armenia and Persia itself. He was, in effect, gambling the empire on a single audacious campaign. For 6 years he did not come home. He fought a war unlike any Roman war before it, ranging through Armenia and Azerbaijan and along the shores of the Caspian Sea, wearing down Persian armies, allying with the pagan Turks of the northern steppes, refusing pitched battles when he was outnumbered and striking hard when opportunity offered. Back in Constantinople, in the summer of 626, the great crisis came. A Persian army stood on the Asian shore. An Avar army with Slavic allies stood on the European shore. The city was besieged from both sides at once, and its emperor was hundreds of miles away in the mountains. But the walls of Theodosius held. The defenders, led by the patriarch Sergius, who paraded an icon of the Virgin along the ramparts, threw back every assault. The imperial fleet in the Golden Horn destroyed the Slavic boats that tried to ferry troops across, and after weeks of fruitless attacks, the Avars gave up and went home. The people of Constantinople credited the Virgin herself with saving the city, and the great hymn known as the Akathist was composed in her honor to mark the deliverance. 2 years later, Heraclius, in the depths of Persia, won a great victory near the ruins of the ancient city of Nineveh, and the Persian king was overthrown by his own nobles. The war was over. The eastern provinces were restored. The true cross was recovered and carried back in triumph to Jerusalem, where Heraclius himself walked barefoot into the city bearing it on his shoulders in 630. It was one of the most complete comebacks in all of history, and men spoke of it as a miracle. They did not know, and could not have known, that in the same years while Heraclius fought his way through the Persian mountains, something was happening in the deserts to the south that would change the world beyond all recognition. In the town of Mecca in western Arabia, a merchant named Mohammed had begun to preach that there was but one God, and that he was that God's final prophet. In the year 622, the same year Heraclius sailed east, Mohammed had been driven from Mecca and taken refuge in the oasis town of Medina, an event the new faith would count as the beginning of its calendar. By the time Heraclius entered Jerusalem in triumph, Mohammed had returned to Mecca as its master. By the time the exhausted Roman armies had returned to their barracks and the Persians had settled into their civil wars, Mohammed was dead, and his followers, now called Muslims, were pouring out of the Arabian Peninsula in armies of astonishing mobility and conviction. They struck a world lying prostrate. The Roman Empire and the Persian Empire had spent the last quarter of a century tearing each other to pieces, and both were exhausted, their treasuries empty, their populations decimated by plague, their border provinces resentful of the taxes that the long wars had required. The Arab armies, small and lightly equipped, moving on camels and horses across country no Roman general thought passable, appeared where they were not expected and vanished when armies were sent against them. In the year 636, at the Battle of the Yarmouk in what is now the border country between Israel, Jordan, and Syria, an Arab army of perhaps 40,000 shattered a Roman army twice its size in a dust storm and open country that favored the desert fighters. Syria fell. In the following year, an even smaller Arab force destroyed the Persian army at Qadisiyah on the plains of Iraq, and the Persian Empire itself, that thousand-year-old rival of Rome, began to crumble beyond saving. By 638, Jerusalem was in Muslim hands again, this time forever, and the patriarch of the city rode out to hand over the keys to the Caliph Umar in person. By 642, Alexandria had surrendered, and Egypt, which the Persians had held for a decade and Heraclius had barely recovered, was lost once more, this time to be lost forever, and the granary of Constantinople was gone. Heraclius, sick and broken, lived just long enough to see it all. He had ruled the empire for 30 years, saved it from Phocas, defeated Persia, recovered the true cross, only to watch in his final months as the deserts of Arabia poured forth a power he could not comprehend, and as the provinces he had bled to reclaim were torn away one after another. He died in the year 641, and his last years are said to have been shadowed by a terror of water so acute that he could not bring himself to cross the narrow strait to Chalcedon on the Asian side, and his last journey home to Constantinople had to be arranged with boats lashed side by side into a bridge of ships strewn with branches and earth, so that he could ride across as though on solid ground. The empire that came out of Heraclius's death was a smaller, harder, poorer thing than the empire he had inherited. Two-thirds of its territory was gone. Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa, the wealthiest and most populous provinces, were now ruled from Damascus and Medina by the caliphs of the new Arab Empire. What remained was essentially Anatolia, the Greek-speaking heartland of Asia Minor, a strip of the Balkans, the coastal shreds of Italy, and the city of Constantinople itself, still holding the seas and the great highways of trade, but hemmed in as it had never been before. The old provincial administration that Justinian had known was disintegrating under the pressure. In its place, a new system slowly took shape out of sheer necessity, an arrangement in which the empire was carved into large military districts called themes, each governed by a general who was both commander and civil administrator, and each supplied by a resident militia of soldier farmers who held their land in return for military service. It was a system born of poverty and desperation, a state that could no longer afford a professional standing army and so had to grow one out of the soil itself, and yet it would prove the making of Byzantium as a medieval power. The theme system would keep the empire in the field for the next 4 centuries. The greatest test of that new system came at the very walls of Constantinople itself. The Arab caliphs, having conquered Persia and swept west along the North African coast, now turned their eyes upon the new Rome. They understood, as every serious power in that world understood, that so long as Constantinople stood, the Roman Empire was not dead, and the Mediterranean was not truly a Muslim sea. They built fleets. They gathered armies. And beginning in the year 674, the first great Arab attempt to take the city began, a campaign that would drag on for 4 years of siege and blockade, with the Muslim navy pressing against the sea walls each summer and withdrawing to winter quarters when the storms came. The defenders held out, year after year, and in the 4th year, in 678, an emperor named Constantine IV, grandson of Heraclius, unveiled the weapon that would keep the new Rome inviolate for centuries to come. It was a Syrian refugee who had brought it to him, a Greek-speaking engineer named Kallinikos who had fled from the Arab conquest of his homeland and made his way to Constantinople with a secret in his head. He had discovered, or perfected, a way of making a liquid mixture that burned on contact with water, that could not be extinguished by ordinary means, that clung to whatever it touched and consumed it in flame. Its exact composition was so closely guarded that we do not know it today, though modern chemists suspect a mixture of naphtha or petroleum, quicklime, sulfur, and pitch, kept under pressure and pumped through bronze siphons in the prows of warships. When Kallinikos showed his invention to the emperor, Constantine understood at once what he had been given. Special ships were fitted with the siphons. Trained crews were drilled in their operation. And when the Arab fleet came against the walls of the city in the summer of 678, the imperial galleys sailed out from the Golden Horn and vomited fire across the water. There is no need to imagine what happened. The chroniclers of every side agree. Ships that could not be reached by arrows or by ramming were burning to the waterline. The flames spread across the surface of the sea itself, and any sailor who leapt overboard to escape found the water on fire around him. The Arab admirals had no answer. Their fleet was shattered, and the remnants that tried to sail home were caught in a storm and destroyed. The siege was broken. The caliph in Damascus sued for a 30-year truce and paid tribute to Constantinople. The weapon that had saved the city acquired a name, though a plain and rather modest one. The Byzantines called it simply the liquid fire, and modern scholars, following a later tradition, call it Greek fire, though the Byzantines themselves would never have used that name, being Romans and not Greeks. The formula was kept as a state secret so absolute that even most Byzantine officers did not know it, and it was passed only from emperor to trusted keeper across the generations. It would be used again, decisively. A generation later, in the year 717, a second and more terrible Arab attempt was made upon the city. This time, the caliph in Damascus threw everything he had at Constantinople. An army of perhaps 120,000 men marched overland through Anatolia and camped before the great land walls. A fleet of 1,800 ships blockaded the sea. It was the largest force ever assembled against the new Rome, and it came against a city torn by internal quarrels, for the reigning emperor had just been overthrown by another general of the Themes, a man named Leo, born in the mountains of Syria, who now took the throne as Leo III at the exact moment the Arab host arrived. Leo had one great advantage. He had risen through the theme system, had commanded armies against the Arabs for years, and knew their tactics as well as they knew his. He also had the liquid fire, and he used it. The Byzantine fleet slipped out of the Golden Horn on a windy night in the autumn of 717 and set upon the great blockade with fire ships, burning a large portion of the Arab navy at anchor. When Bulgarian tribes from beyond the Danube, allied by treaty with the emperor, fell upon the Arab army from behind, the besiegers began to starve. The winter that followed was the coldest anyone remembered. Arab soldiers froze in their tents. Their reinforcement fleets, when they came in the spring, were also caught by the Byzantine fire, and the Egyptian rowers on those fleets, many of them Christian Copts, defected to the empire in whole crews. By August of 718, 1 year after they had come, the shattered remains of the Arab host lifted the siege and stumbled home. Of the great fleet, only 5 ships are said to have returned to Alexandria. Twice in 40 years, then, the walls of Constantinople and the fire of Callinicos had turned back the full might of the caliphate. The Muslim tide, which had rolled from Spain to India, broke against those triple ramparts on the Bosphorus and did not go further. Historians of a later age would come to see this as one of the decisive moments of the world, comparable to the Battle of Tours in the Frankish country far to the west, where Charles Martel would break another Arab army 14 years later. Whether or not Europe would have become Muslim if Constantinople had fallen in 718 is a question no one can answer, but it is at least worth asking, and the Byzantines of that age had no doubts. They believed, as devoutly as they believed anything, that the city had been saved by the direct intervention of the Virgin, whose icon had been carried around the walls during the darkest days of the siege, and they thanked her for her mercy in ceremony after ceremony down the centuries. But saving the city was one thing. What its salvation meant, and what kind of city had been saved, and above all what kind of God had saved it, and how that God ought to be worshipped, these were questions on which the Byzantines were about to fall upon one another with a bitterness that startled even them. Leo III, the emperor who had held the walls in 717, was a stern, plain, unimaginative soldier from the eastern frontier, and he had spent his early life in country where Christians rubbed shoulders with Muslims and Jews, and where both of those older traditions of monotheism looked upon the Christian veneration of holy images with disdain and even horror. The second commandment given to Moses had forbidden the making of graven images. The Muslims, sweeping out of Arabia, had refused to depict living beings in their art. And here were the Christians of the Roman world, kissing painted panels of saints, bowing before mosaics of the Virgin, carrying icons around the walls of their capital in procession, and treating the images themselves, in the eyes of some, as though they possessed a kind of holy presence. Was that idolatry? Was that why God had allowed the Arabs to strip away the eastern provinces, as a punishment for the sins of a people who had drifted into pagan practices under Christian name? Leo III became convinced that it was, and in the year 726, he began quietly at first, then more openly, to preach against the use of holy images and to order their removal from churches. There was a great bronze icon of Christ over one of the palace gates. Leo sent an officer with a ladder to take it down. A crowd of women in the street below, seeing the workman climb up, dragged him from the ladder and killed him on the spot. And so began the movement history calls iconoclasm, the breaking of images, a civil war within Christianity that would tear the empire for more than a century. It is difficult, at this distance of time, to convey how deeply the quarrel ran. It was not merely a debate over church decoration. The icon defenders argued that a holy image of Christ was the very proof that Christ had truly become a man, that he had a real face that could be seen and painted, and that to reject his image was to reject the incarnation itself. The iconoclasts argued that to worship any image was to violate the fundamental law given to Moses, and that Christ's true image was the Eucharist alone. Emperors would fall on one side or the other. Monks who defended the icons, and the monasteries themselves which produced and treasured them, would be persecuted by iconoclast emperors, their images smashed, their walls whitewashed, their leaders exiled or tortured. Then a new emperor of the other party would come to the throne and restore the icons and persecute those who had persecuted the monks. And through it all, in the streets of Constantinople, ordinary people brawled with their neighbors and denounced their brothers and hid their private household icons in secret alcoves. It was one of the strangest and fiercest religious quarrels ever fought, and it would not be finally settled in favor of the icons until the year 843, when an empress named Theodora, no relation to Justinian's Theodora, but a name that seems to attach itself to strong women in Byzantine history, would restore the icons for good on a day the Orthodox Church still keeps as the Feast of Orthodoxy. Out of the long convulsion of iconoclasm, the empire emerged in the middle of the 9th century, smaller than Justinian's realm, but tougher, more coherent, and more distinctly itself than it had ever been. The Latin language had faded out of official use. Greek was now the tongue of the government, the army, and the church, and the elaborate Roman legal codes of Justinian had been reworked into Greek editions that ordinary judges could actually apply. The people still called themselves Romans, and would go on doing so until the end, but the world had drifted on and become something new. Around the emperor now moved a court of stunning ritual, choreographed in a book of ceremonies that laid out for every occasion of the year the exact robes he should wear, the exact gestures the officials should make, the exact hymns the choirs should sing. Foreign envoys who came to Constantinople in the 10th century wrote home in dazzled disbelief. There was a golden throne in the audience chamber whose seat could be raised toward the ceiling by hidden machinery, and mechanical golden lions that roared and beat the ground with their tails, and jeweled bronze trees whose leaves quivered and whose birds sang, all designed to overwhelm any visiting barbarian with the sense that he had entered a world that was scarcely mortal. The dynasty that presided over this golden century took its name from an unlikely founder. He was called Basil, a peasant boy of Armenian descent who had grown up in the theme of Macedonia in the northern Balkans and who had come to Constantinople in his youth as a strapping stable boy looking for work. He had a knack for horses, and he was strong enough to bend an iron horseshoe with his bare hands, and one day, according to the stories, he was noticed by a senior official who took him into his service. From there, he passed into the household of the reigning emperor, a weak and pleasure-loving man named Michael, who came to depend on Basil in the intimate and dangerous ways such rulers sometimes did. Basil was made co-emperor. Then, in the year 867, he arranged the murder of his patron and seized the throne alone. It was not an edifying way to found a dynasty, but the dynasty he founded, the Macedonian, would rule the empire for the better part of 2 centuries, and under it Byzantium would rise once more to its full height. Basil I was followed by his son Leo VI, called the Wise, an emperor who wrote poetry and law and military manuals, and whose reign was quiet at home but troubled by the arrival of new enemies on the frontiers. There were the Bulgars, a Turkic people who had settled in the Balkans 2 centuries earlier, mingled with the Slavic population, adopted Christianity from Byzantine missionaries, and by now formed a powerful kingdom whose rulers had begun to dream of one day taking Constantinople itself. There were the Rus, the Viking traders from the north who had settled around Kiev and now came down the rivers to the Black Sea in their long boats, sometimes to trade and sometimes to raid. There were the Muslim emirates that had carved out states on Crete and along the coasts of Anatolia, using their fleets to prey on Byzantine shipping and to sack Byzantine towns. Against all these the empire pushed back, at first slowly and then with growing confidence. The 10th century saw a succession of remarkable soldier emperors, some of them born to the purple, and some of them regents who ruled for underage members of the Macedonian line. And under them, the frontiers began to move outward for the first time in 300 years. Crete was recovered from its Muslim rulers in the year 961 by a general named Nikephoros Phocas, who then went on to reconquer Cyprus and to drive deep into Syria, taking the great city of Antioch itself in 969, a city Byzantium had not held since the days of Heraclius. This same Nikephoros seized the imperial throne after the death of the reigning emperor, married that emperor's widow to legitimize himself, and became one of the strangest rulers ever to sit in the palace at Constantinople, a stern soldier and ascetic who wore a hair shirt under his imperial robes, slept on the floor beside his ceremonial bed, and treated the whole business of governance as a kind of unwelcome distraction from his religious devotions. He was murdered in his own bedchamber by his wife's lover, a nephew named John Tzimiskes, who then took the throne himself and turned out to be an even more brilliant general than his uncle, and who continued the reconquest into Palestine, coming within striking distance of Jerusalem before political troubles at home called him back. But the greatest of the Macedonians, and one of the most formidable men who ever wore a crown, was still to come. It was Basil II, grandson of Basil I, born in 958 into all the softness and ceremony of the palace, but shaped by circumstance into something quite different. He came to the throne as a boy of 18 in 976 and spent the first 15 years of his reign fighting off a series of great rebellions by the Anatolian nobility, ambitious generals who thought this stripling could be pushed aside as easily as his weaker predecessors. They were wrong. Basil learned generalship in the field, in the hardest of schools, and by the year 989 he had broken them all. He emerged from those wars a changed man and would remain so for the rest of his very long life. He would not marry. He would keep no mistresses. He would take no interest in the ceremonies of the court beyond what was strictly necessary. He wore plain dark robes rather than the imperial purple. He ate simply, slept in ordinary tents when campaigning, spoke in short, blunt sentences, and hoarded gold as fiercely as a miser, filling the treasury of the empire to a level it had not seen in centuries. And he turned his entire attention, with a patience that seemed almost inhuman, upon the settling of accounts with the empire's oldest enemy in the Balkans, the Kingdom of Bulgaria. The Bulgars, under a series of aggressive rulers, had by Basil's youth spread over most of the Western Balkans, from the Danube down to the borders of Greece, and their most dangerous king, a man named Samuel, had come very close to establishing a rival Christian empire in the peninsula. He had even taken the imperial title for himself. He had sacked cities as far south as the coasts of the Peloponnese. Basil resolved that this would end. He began the war in the last years of the 10th century, and he pursued it, off and on, for nearly a quarter of a century. He did not seek showy, pitched battles. He fought a war of attrition, marching year after year up into the Bulgarian mountains, taking fortress after fortress, wasting the countryside, wearing his opponent down. Samuel of Bulgaria was a resourceful adversary, and the war went on far longer than Basil had expected. But the empire had the deeper reserves, and Basil had the deeper patience. The end came in the summer of 1014 at a mountain pass called Cladion, deep in the Bulgarian highlands. Basil trapped a large Bulgarian army in the pass and destroyed it utterly. Some 14,000 Bulgarian soldiers were taken prisoner, and here Basil did the thing for which history would remember him with a shudder. He ordered his surgeons to blind them. Every one of the 14,000 had both his eyes put out, except for every 100th man, who was left with a single eye to lead his 99 blind comrades back to the Bulgarian king. Such was the imperial mercy of Basil II. It is said that when Samuel saw his broken army stumbling back through his mountains in that horrifying procession, he suffered a stroke and died within days. His kingdom held on for a few more years under lesser rulers, but the will to fight was gone, and by 1018 all of Bulgaria was in Basil's hands, added to the empire as a set of new themes, its aristocracy pensioned off with imperial titles, its people brought back under the rule of Constantinople for the first time in 4 centuries. Basil rode in triumph through the streets of the capital with the treasures of the Bulgarian court paraded before him, and he acquired the grim epithet by which he is still known, the Bulgar Slayer. He lived until 1025, dying at the age of 67 after a reign of nearly half a century. When he died, the empire he left behind was arguably the greatest power in the Christian world. Its frontiers ran from the Danube to Armenia, from southern Italy to Syria. Its treasury was overflowing. Its armies were seasoned and undefeated. Its coinage was the most trusted in the Mediterranean. Its capital city, with a population perhaps of 500,000, was without rival in Europe. Byzantium had risen from the ruin of the 7th century to become, once again, the new Rome its founder had dreamed of. It was, in the truest sense, an empire that had refused to die. And yet, in one of the recurring cruelties of Byzantine history, the very completeness of Basil's success would set the stage for its unraveling. He had ruled so long and so personally, had crushed the great noble families so thoroughly, had trusted so few, that he had built no institutions to outlast him. He had never married, and he left no son. The throne passed to his elderly and utterly incompetent brother Constantine VIII, who reigned for 3 years of self-indulgence before dying, and after Constantine, to a series of Basil's nieces and great-nieces, agging princesses of the palace who were pushed into marriages with a string of unsuitable husbands, each of whom fancied himself an emperor and none of whom possessed a fraction of Basil's ability. Meanwhile, the great Anatolian noble families that Basil had held down began to lift their heads again, and the theme armies that had been the empire's backbone began to be neglected in favor of mercenary bands hired from foreign lands. Within a generation of Basil's death, the machinery of the state was fraying in ways no one wished to see. The strength he had built up would be spent, and quickly. And out of the eastern steppes, a new people, the Seljuk Turks, was already gathering strength. The disaster that ended the great century of Basil II came at a place called Manzikert in the far east of Anatolia in the summer of 1071. The reigning emperor, a well-meaning military man named Romanos Diogenes, had come to the throne only 3 years earlier, married to one of the agging princesses of the Macedonian line, and he had spent his brief reign trying to restore the neglected eastern armies and to deal with the mounting raids of the Seljuk Turks, who had swept out of Central Asia, taken Persia and Baghdad, and now pressed against the Byzantine frontier in Armenia. He marched east that summer with a large army, aiming to bring the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan to a decisive battle. He got his battle, and it was one of the most consequential defeats in the whole story of the Christian East. Through poor coordination, treachery among his own commanders, and the swift-riding tactics of the Turkish horse archers, who would not stand and fight a Roman line, the imperial army was surrounded and shattered. The emperor himself, refusing to flee, was captured on the battlefield, an almost unheard-of humiliation for a Roman ruler. The Sultan, as we have already glimpsed in the story of the First Crusade, treated his captured enemy with courtesy and eventually released him. His own people were less kind. When Romanos made his way back through Anatolia, he found that a rival faction had seized the throne in his absence and declared him deposed. He was blinded so brutally that he died of his wounds within weeks, and the Byzantine state fell into a full-blown civil war between competing generals, each of whom preferred to fight his rivals for the throne rather than defend the frontier. In the confusion of the next decade, the Turks did not so much conquer Anatolia as walk into it. Byzantine commanders actually hired them as allies against other Byzantines. Warbands settled where they liked. Town after town, valley after valley, the great Greek-speaking heartland that had been the empire's backbone since the 7th century was lost. And by the time an emperor came to the throne who could deal seriously with the problem, most of Anatolia was gone, and a Turkish sultan sat at Nicaea within sight of the walls of Constantinople. That emperor was Alexios Komnenos, whom we have already met in the story of the First Crusade, the cunning, patient, unfailingly courteous survivor who seized the throne in 1081 and set about the exhausting work of rebuilding a state on the verge of collapse. He bought off the Normans in the west, defeated the Pechenegs in the north, played the various Turkish emirs against one another in the east, and when at last he sent his fateful appeal to the Latin West asking for a few thousand mercenaries to help him recover his lost lands, received in reply the great wave of the First Crusade, that vast unruly flood of armed pilgrims which we have followed in another telling, and which need not detain us again here. What matters for our present purpose is what came out of that strange partnership. Alexios and his son John and his grandson Manuel, three able Comnenian emperors ruling in succession across the 12th century, used the Crusades and the alliances they made and unmade with the Latin lords of the new Crusader states to claw back a great deal of what Byzantium had lost. Under them, the empire recovered coastal Anatolia, refilled its treasury through trade, and once more became a great power in the eastern Mediterranean, a hub between the Latin West and the Islamic East, its silks and its coins traveling everywhere, its diplomats spinning their webs in every court from Norman Sicily to Fatimid Cairo. But the recovery was fragile and rested on the personal ability of the men who ruled it. Manuel Comnenos, the last of the great Comnenian emperors, was a magnificent figure in his lifetime, tall and handsome, a lover of Western tournaments and jousting, fluent in the languages of the Latins, whom he both admired and manipulated, master of an empire whose court dazzled every visitor. He tried to reunify the two churches. He tried to reconquer Italy. He tried to establish Byzantine supremacy over the Crusader states of Syria. He fought campaigns from Hungary to Egypt. And in 1176, at a mountain pass called Myriokphalon in central Anatolia, he was ambushed by a Turkish army in almost exactly the same way as Romanos had been at Manzikert a century before, and his great army was crushed. The disaster was not quite so total, and Manuel escaped with his life, but the effect on the emperor's confidence and on the reputation of the empire was terrible. He died 4 years later a broken man, and the empire once more lost its footing. What followed was a quarter century of decline. Manuel's young son was murdered by a cousin, who was then murdered by a rival, who was in turn deposed by his own brother, and the great families of the capital fought one another for control while the provinces slid into rebellion. The Bulgarians in the Balkans, whom Basil II had so thoroughly crushed, threw off imperial rule and set up a second Bulgarian empire. The Serbs consolidated into their own kingdom. Italian merchant cities, above all the Venetians, whose special trading privileges had grown enormous under the Comnenians, came to dominate the commercial life of Constantinople in ways that infuriated the ordinary population. And in 1182, a mob of Greeks fell upon the Latin quarters of the capital and massacred every foreigner they could catch, priests and women and children alike, in an outburst of xenophobic fury that shocked the whole Latin world. Venice would remember it. So would Rome. The reckoning came in 1204, in the strangest and most terrible episode of the whole 1,000-year history of the new Rome. A new crusade had been called by Pope Innocent III, aimed at recovering Jerusalem, which had fallen to Saladin in 1187. The great lords of France and Flanders gathered their armies at Venice, having contracted with the Venetian doge, Enrico Dandolo, an old man now blind and past 90, but still one of the sharpest minds in the Mediterranean, to transport them by sea to Egypt. But the Crusaders could not pay the enormous sum they had promised. Dandolo, holding them hostage on the island where their fleet was gathered, offered them a bargain. If they would help Venice recover a rebellious city on the Adriatic coast, they could sail on his ships. They did so, and then a further temptation was placed before them. A young Byzantine prince named Alexios, son of a deposed emperor, appeared in their camp, offering enormous sums of money and a promise to submit the Greek church to Rome if only the Crusaders would help him restore his father to the throne of Constantinople. The offer was irresistible. The crusade turned east. They came to the walls of Constantinople in the summer of 1203. They forced their way through the harbor defenses, restored the young Alexios and his blind father as co-emperors, and settled outside the city to wait for the promised rewards. Those rewards never came because there was no money to pay them. The Byzantines had been drained by decades of misrule, and no puppet emperor could squeeze what did not exist. The crowds of Constantinople, resenting the foreign occupiers in their suburbs and the puppets on their throne, rose in fury. Young Alexios was strangled by a court faction. The Crusaders, denied their money and now facing a hostile city, made their fateful decision. In April of 1204, After a second siege, they broke through the sea walls, entered the city, and for 3 days they did what victorious armies had done in ancient times, but what no army had done to Constantinople in 900 years. They sacked it. The horror of that sack passed into legend, and modern historians have, if anything, confirmed it. The Crusaders, drunk on wine and violence, slaughtered whoever they encountered without regard to age or sex or standing. They broke into churches and monasteries and stripped the altars. In the Hagia Sophia itself, the greatest church in Christendom, they smashed the silver iconostasis and the imperial tombs, tore down the great veil embroidered with images of the saints, and set a common prostitute on the patriarch's throne to sing bawdy songs while the soldiers drank from the sacred vessels. The libraries of the city, holding in their scrolls and codices the accumulated learning of 1,000 years of Greek civilization, were pillaged and burned. Relics were carried off by the cartload to be sold to churches and cathedrals across Latin Europe, so that to this day one may go to Venice and see the 4 bronze horses that once stood above the hippodrome, or to Amiens and see the head of John the Baptist, or to 100 other western towns and see fragments of the true cross and the crown of thorns and the bones of countless saints, all of them Byzantine plunder from that dreadful April. Innumerable statues of classical antiquity, some of them saved from pagan temples 800 or 900 years earlier by Constantine himself, and gathered in the forums of the New Rome, were melted down for their bronze. Whole neighborhoods were burned. The city that had turned back Persians and Arabs and Bulgars was gutted by fellow Christians in a way its Muslim enemies had never come close to achieving. When the smoke cleared, the Crusaders divided the empire among themselves. A Latin emperor was set upon the throne of Constantinople, one of the Flemish counts, and Latin lords carved out principalities in the Greek countryside. The Venetians took the choicest ports and the great islands, including Crete, and Doge Dandolo returned to Venice with more booty than any man had ever brought home before, though he himself died the following year and was buried in the Hagia Sophia. The Byzantine imperial family and its remaining followers fled to Anatolia, where they established a government in exile at Nicaea, and there they nursed their grievance and planned their return. They did return. In 1261, a Byzantine general named Michael Palaiologos, ruling from Nicaea, retook Constantinople almost by accident when a small scouting party slipped in through an unguarded gate one night and found the Latin garrison largely absent. The Latin emperor fled by boat in his nightshirt, and the new Rome was in Greek hands again. But the empire that came back to Constantinople in 1261 was not the empire that had been lost in 1204. It was a shrunken, impoverished, wounded thing, a shadow of its former self, and the wound of the Fourth Crusade would never truly heal. Byzantium would go on for another 2 centuries, but it would go on dying slowly from that April afternoon when the Christians of the West had come through its walls. The 2 centuries that followed the recovery of Constantinople in 1261 were the long twilight of Byzantium. The emperors of the Palaiologan dynasty, who ruled from Michael VIII down to the very end, presided over a state that grew smaller and poorer with almost every reign. Harried on every side by enemies its ancestors would have brushed aside, unable to pay its soldiers, unable to feed its people, unable even to maintain the great buildings that Justinian and the Comnenians had raised. And yet, in a way that has always seemed to observers slightly miraculous, this shrinking empire produced in its last 150 years one of the most remarkable cultural flowerings of its whole long history, a revival of learning and painting and theology that historians now call the Palaiologan Renaissance, when scholars in the crumbling capital rediscovered the ancient Greek philosophers, when icons acquired a new depth and humanity of expression, when the mosaics of monasteries like the Chora in Constantinople reached a beauty that had scarcely been equaled in any age. It was as though the dying empire, sensing what was coming, was determined to leave behind the most eloquent testimony it could of what it had been. The territorial losses were relentless. In Asia Minor, that heartland which Alexios and the Comnenians had partly recovered, a new Turkish power was rising. It had begun as one small emirate among many, founded around the year 1300 by a chieftain named Osman, whose followers came to be called Ottomans. Under Osman and his sons, this modest principality expanded with steady, patient skill, absorbing its Turkish neighbors, taking Byzantine towns one after another, drawing Christian peasants under its protection with a light hand of taxation and a promise of stability. In 1326, the Ottomans took the important city of Bursa and made it their capital. In 1331, they took Nicaea, the very city where the first great council of the Church had met 1,000 years earlier, and where the exiled emperors had ruled during the Latin occupation. In 1337, they took Nicomedia. By the middle of the 14th century, the entire Byzantine presence in Asia had been reduced to a few coastal towns. Then the Ottomans crossed into Europe. In 1354, by pure luck for them, a great earthquake damaged the walls of the small Byzantine fortress of Gallipoli on the European side of the Dardanelles at the very moment when an Ottoman army happened to be encamped on the opposite shore. They crossed at once, occupied the ruined town, and refused to give it back. From that beachhead, they began the systematic conquest of the Balkans. Adrianople, the ancient city where a Roman emperor had fallen to the Goths 1,000 years before, was taken in 1369 and made the Ottoman capital, a startling choice that showed how firmly the sultans meant to root themselves in Europe. Bulgaria was overrun. Serbia was broken at the terrible Battle of Kosovo in 1389. By the end of the 14th century, the Byzantine emperor, who once had ruled from Italy to Syria, held only Constantinople itself, a strip of coastline near it, some fragments of Greece, and the Peloponnesian Peninsula in the far south, called by the classical name of Mora, where his younger sons and brothers ruled small courts as princes. Even at Constantinople itself, the emperor's authority was shaken to its foundations by a series of civil wars, in which the sons and brothers and cousins of the Paleologan house fought one another for a throne whose real power grew smaller with each contest. Byzantine princes actually married their daughters to Ottoman sultans and sent Byzantine troops to fight in Ottoman armies against other Christian powers. The Emperor John V traveled to Italy and to Hungary begging for help against the Turks. His son Manuel II went further still. In the years around 1400, he made a tour of the Latin West that lasted 3 years, visiting Venice, Milan, Paris, and London, being received with respect and given gifts and sympathy and vague promises of aid. While at home, the Turks besieged his capital, and only the intervention of the Central Asian conqueror Timur, who defeated the Ottoman Sultan at Ankara in 1402 and threw the Ottoman state into a decade of civil war, saved Constantinople from falling then and there. It was a reprieve, no more. The Ottomans recovered, and by the 1420s were pressing again against the walls of the new Rome. By the middle of the 15th century, the situation was as grim as it had ever been in the empire's long history. The reigning emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, who came to the throne in 1449, ruled a state that consisted essentially of the city of Constantinople and a few small dependencies. The population of the great capital, which had been 500,000 or more in Justinian's day, had shrunk to perhaps 40 or 50,000, huddled inside walls that could hold many times that number. Whole quarters of the ancient city were empty, gone back to vineyards and pastures, with the ruined arches of old palaces rising above the vines. The great harbors were silted up. The imperial fleet had almost ceased to exist. The Ottoman Sultan, a young man of 21 named Mehmed II, who had come to his throne in 1451, ruled a vast Muslim empire that surrounded Constantinople on every side, its European provinces to the north and west, its Asian provinces to the south and east. And this young sultan had made no secret of his intention to complete his ancestors' work and take the city that was still, in Muslim eyes, an unfinished business. A Christian stronghold in the middle of an Islamic world. Constantine XI sent envoys to every court in Europe begging for help. He sent them to Rome and to Venice and to Genoa and to the German emperor and to the kings of France and Aragon and Hungary. He offered, in return for military aid, the greatest concession any Byzantine emperor had ever offered: the formal reunion of the Greek and Latin churches under the authority of the Pope, a decision that infuriated many of his own subjects in Constantinople, where a famous cry ran through the streets in the last months before the siege that they would rather see the turban of the Turk in the city than the tiara of the Latin. But the emperor had no choice. He signed the union of the churches, celebrated it publicly in the Hagia Sophia, and waited to see whether any Western army would come. Very little came. A few hundred Italian volunteers under a brilliant Genoese soldier named Giovanni Giustiniani arrived to help defend the walls. A handful of ships came from Venice and Genoa. That was almost all. The strange twist that would decide the siege had to do with the walls themselves. The land walls of Constantinople, the great triple ramparts that Theodosius had raised 1,000 years before, had turned back every siege since they were built, from the Avars in 626 to the Arabs in 717 and 718 to the Bulgars and the Rus and the Ottomans themselves in 1422. They were among the strongest fortifications in the world, and no siege engine yet devised had been able to break them. But in the winter before the final siege, there arrived at Maims court a Hungarian engineer named Orban, a Christian by baptism, but a man for hire, who had first offered his services to the Byzantines in Constantinople. He had told the emperor and his advisors that he could build a cannon of a size no one had ever seen before, a bombard capable of hurling stones so heavy and so fast that the ancient walls could not withstand it. Constantine and his ministers listened, but they had no money to pay what Orban asked, and only slender resources with which to gather the copper and tin and iron he required, and eventually, with regret, they let him go. He crossed over to Maimed, who received him warmly, gave him everything he requested, and set him to work at once. What Orban built over the following months in the Ottoman foundries at Adrianople became one of the most famous weapons of the 15th century. It was a monster cannon, 27 feet long, made of bronze in a single enormous casting. It bore a full 30 inches across, capable of firing a stone ball weighing more than half a ton. It required 60 oxen to pull it, and 200 men walking beside it to steady it on the road. Its fuses had to be lit with special ceremony, and it could only be fired 7 times a day, because it took hours to cool between shots. There were other, smaller cannon in the great train that Maimed brought against Constantinople, dozens of them altogether, but it was Orban's great bombard that captured the imagination of everyone who saw it. The Byzantines watched it being dragged into position across the plain outside their walls and understood what it meant. The age when their ancient ramparts could shrug off any blow was ending. Something had changed in the world. The siege began in the first week of April 1453 and lasted 7 weeks. Constantine, the 11th, had perhaps 7,000 fighting men to defend a perimeter that ought to have required 50,000. Maimed had brought some 80,000 troops and irregulars, and his fleet dominated the sea. Day after day, the great cannon boomed. The ancient walls, which had been repaired hastily over the winter, cracked and crumbled where its stones struck. The defenders threw up hasty barricades of earth and timber behind the breaches and drove back assault after assault, hand to hand along the ramparts, in fighting that went on through the nights by the light of torches. The Genoese commander Giustiniani, wounded on the walls in the final assault, was carried off the battlefield mortally hurt, and his troops, seeing their captain being taken away, began to lose heart. The Ottomans found a small postern gate left unlocked by accident. They poured through. The city that had been the new Rome for 1123 years fell in the last hours of the 29th of May. We come at last to the final hours, and to the man who walked into them with his eyes open. Constantine, the 11th Palaiologos, was in his late 40s on that spring morning, a widower twice over, childless, a soldier by upbringing and a statesman by necessity, and by the accounts of those who knew him in his last months, a man who had made his peace with what was coming. He had lived long enough to see the empire reduced from a great Mediterranean power to a single besieged city, had begged in vain for help from every court that would receive his letters, had signed a church union that most of his own subjects reviled, and had put on his armor each morning of the siege and gone up on the walls with the ordinary soldiers to fight beside them. He had refused all offers from Maimed to save himself and his household in return for surrendering the city. He had told the Sultan's envoys that as for surrendering Constantinople, this was not in his power, nor in the power of any of its inhabitants, that they had all resolved together to die, and would not spare their lives. On the night before the final assault, he attended a service in the Hagia Sophia, which he had not entered since the union of the churches had been proclaimed there, and which many of his own subjects had shunned as polluted by Latin heresy. That night, in the shadow of the great dome that Justinian had raised 900 years before, Greeks and Latins together, Orthodox and Catholic, priests and soldiers, and ordinary people, took communion side by side for what almost everyone in the church understood would be the last time. The emperor received the sacrament, and then went out to bid farewell to his household in the palace, asking forgiveness of everyone he had ever wronged, weeping openly. He rode to the walls in the small hours of the morning, and there he waited for the assault which he knew was coming with the dawn. It came in 3 great waves. The Ottoman irregulars first, thrown against the walls to exhaust the defenders. Then the disciplined regulars of the Sultan's army. And finally, in the hour before dawn, the Janissaries, the elite Ottoman infantry, hurled themselves at the breach where Orban's cannon had done its work. Giustiniani, the Genoese commander who had been the soul of the defense, was struck by a bullet in that final assault, and his troops carried him away toward the harbor and their ships. And when the ordinary defenders saw him go, some of them began to slip away as well. Almost at the same moment, an Ottoman detachment discovered that a small gate had been left open by accident, and they poured through into the city behind the defenders on the walls. The end came very quickly after that. Ottoman banners went up on the ramparts. Panic ran through the streets. The great cry began that the city was taken. Constantine the 11th, seeing his position collapsing around him, understood what he had to do. He took off his imperial regalia. He removed the double-headed eagles from his robes and the purple boots from his feet so that he could not be identified and taken alive to be paraded through the streets. He drew his sword. And then, with 2 or 3 companions, one of them said to have been his cousin, he charged into the mass of Ottoman soldiers pouring through the broken walls, and he vanished. His body was never certainly identified. Some later Ottoman sources claimed that a corpse in the purple boots had been found in the pile of the dead near one of the gates, and that the Sultan had commanded the head to be paraded on a pike. But this account was disputed even at the time, and other stories quickly grew up around the mystery of the emperor's end. A legend arose almost at once, and it has never quite died, that Constantine had not truly perished at all, that an angel had descended in the moment of the city's fall, had taken up the last emperor of the Romans, and had spirited him away to a hidden chamber deep beneath the earth, where he lies asleep in marble, holding his sword, waiting for the day when God will summon him to rise again, drive the Turks from the city, and restore the empire that had refused to die. It is a legend, and yet it captures something true. Byzantium did not simply end on that Tuesday morning in May of 1453. Something of it survived the fall of its capital, and something of it survives even now. Maimed II, when he rode through the shattered gate on the afternoon of the 29th of May and saw the city stretched out before him, is said to have been moved almost to tears. He was a cultivated young man who read Greek and Persian and Arabic, who admired the classical heritage as much as any Byzantine emperor had done, and he now made himself the guardian of what was left. He rode to the Hagia Sophia, dismounted, put a handful of earth on his turban as a gesture of humility, and entered the great church. It was converted to a mosque, but its structure was preserved. He appointed a new Greek patriarch to lead the Orthodox Christians who remained in his city. He rebuilt what had been destroyed. He proclaimed himself, in Greek and Turkish alike, Caesari Rum, the Caesar of Rome, and his court and his heirs would go on using that title down the centuries, and would think of themselves in some real sense as the continuers of the imperial tradition that had begun with Augustus and had passed to Constantine, and had come down through all the emperors whose names we have followed in this long telling. The last outposts of Byzantine rule held on for a few years more. Trebizond, on the far shore of the Black Sea, where a rump empire had ruled since the sack of 1204, fell in 1461. The last Byzantine princes in the Peloponnesian Mora were driven out by 1460, and one of them, a nephew of the last emperor, made his way to Rome, where the Pope gave him a pension and a title, and where he eventually sold his hereditary rights to the imperial throne to the Tsar of Russia, so that Moscow, which had received its Christianity from Byzantine missionaries 5 centuries before, now began to speak of itself as the Third Rome, the true successor of Constantine's city, the last standing capital of Orthodox Christendom. That was a claim the Tsars would make down to the very end of their line, and it was one of the many curious afterlives of the empire we have been following. There are others. Byzantine scholars, fleeing westward in the years before and after the fall of Constantinople, carried with them into Italy the manuscripts of the ancient Greek philosophers and poets and mathematicians and playwrights, and they became teachers in the courts and academies of the Renaissance, so that men like Plato and Sophocles and Archimedes came back into the Latin West, in Greek, and set the imaginations of a whole generation of Italian humanists on fire, and gave to Renaissance Europe some of the intellectual materials out of which the modern world would eventually be built. Without the fall of Byzantium, we may plausibly suppose, the Renaissance would not have taken the shape it did. Constantinople, in its dying, gave to the West a great inheritance, though the West had done so much to hasten that dying. Byzantine law, which Justinian had gathered and codified, went on being studied in the universities of medieval and early modern Europe, and it lies at the foundation of the legal systems of much of the continent to this day. Byzantine coinage and diplomacy and administration set patterns that were copied by Muslims and Slavs and Latins alike. The Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe, evangelized from Constantinople in the 9th and 10th centuries, took their alphabet from Byzantine missionaries, took their liturgy from Byzantine hymns, took their architecture from Byzantine churches, and shaped their national cultures around a Christian tradition that ran back through the New Rome to the ancient one. The great cathedrals of Kiev and Moscow and Belgrade and Sofia are all, in some sense, daughters of the Hagia Sophia. The double-headed eagle that Constantine XI wore into the breach is on flags today in Albania and Serbia and Montenegro, and until a century ago it was on the flags of Russia. The empire that refused to die survived its own death in all of these many ways. The Hagia Sophia itself still stands. It has been a Byzantine church, an Ottoman mosque, a modern museum, and a mosque again. And through all these changes, the great dome that Anthemius and Isidore raised in 5 years for Justinian has held its place above the city that Constantine founded on the Bosphorus. If you walk into it now, in what is called Istanbul, and if you tilt your head back, you can still see, if the light is right and the mosaics have been left uncovered, the faces of Byzantine emperors and their empresses looking down from the golden vaults, offering their models of the church itself to a Christ who has been painted over and rediscovered and painted over and rediscovered again across 1500 years. They are the faces of the people whose story we have followed. Justinian in his prime, and Theodora in her jeweled crown, and John and Manuel Comnenos, and the Paleologan princes, and the founders and the survivors and the dreamers of the new Rome. They are quiet now. So is the great church. So is the city. The empire that once stretched from Italy to Armenia, from the Danube to the sands of Africa, is a memory now, held in books and mosaics and hymns and legends. But the memory is a stubborn thing, as stubborn as the walls that turn back 1,000 years of enemies, as stubborn as the old belief that somewhere beneath the stones of Constantinople, the last emperor sleeps in marble with his sword across his chest, waiting. That is the story of Byzantium, the empire that refused to die, from a spear traced in the dust of the Bosphorus in the year 330 to a marble chamber in a legend where its last emperor still sleeps. It is a long story, and if you have stayed with it all the way through the night, or if you have drifted off somewhere in the middle and are only now waking to find it ending, either is well. There is another video waiting for you on the screen whenever you feel ready. If you have enjoyed this one, feel free to like, to subscribe, or to leave a thought in the comments below. But there is no rush. Set the day aside now. Close your eyes. Let yourself settle. The new Rome has stood watch for a very long time, and it can stand watch a little longer while you rest. Sleep well and sweet dreams.